Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Megsy if you're new here, and because we are approaching the month of August, it is going to be Women in Translation Month. This is something that was started in 2014 by a woman named, let me pull up her name, Miral Radzinski. And it has become a widely recognized moment because the majority of books that end up being translated are usually from European countries, often by male authors, male translators. And so since August is Women in Translation Month, I decided to make a list of 10 books by women that were translated into English that I think you should read. Most of these books I have already read and I own. There's a couple here that I'm planning to read very soon. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The first book is a book that I literally just picked up in a little lending library this weekend in my neighborhood, and it is called The Tent by Miral al-Tahawy. This was published in Egypt, so it's translated from Arabic. It was published by the American University in Cairo Press in the mid-90s. And it follows a group of Bedouins, a nomadic Arab tribe, that specifically follows a young girl and her relationship with her father and a foreign woman who is well-meaning but ultimately motivated by self-interest. It says the book provides an intimate glimpse inside the women's quarters and chronicles their pastimes and preoccupations, their stories, and their songs. This was translated by Anthony Calderbank. And there is a translator's introduction about the Bedouin. I think this specifically takes place in Egypt's eastern desert. So I'm looking forward to reading this because I have not heard about this author. My channel does focus a lot on Arab writers, but more so within the West, like Arab American writers. So I definitely want to read more books by people who are directly from these countries and living in them. The next book is also a book I picked up this weekend at Barnes & Noble, and it is, that almost fell, another novella, and it is by the author Adania Shibli, We Are All Equally Far from Love. So Adania Shibli is most well known for her novella Minor Detail, which I have talked about quite a bit on this channel. You can see my review in my March wrap-up, but I'm not going to talk about that book anymore because I've talked about it so much. So I wanted to pick up another piece of her work. This is about a young woman. It takes place, I think, in Palestine because she is a Palestinian author. And it is about a young woman who works at the post office, and she's instructed by her boss to write a love letter to an older man. And they conduct this sort of correspondence over letters until his letters one day stop. And then meanwhile, there's this sort of family drama. Her dad has left her mom, and her dad is apparently like a collaborator. I don't know what the Israelis. So I think it sounds interesting. Again, this isn't like as highly lauded as Minor Detail, but I did want to check out her work. And if you haven't read Minor Detail, I highly, highly recommend it. This was translated by Paul Starkey. And the last book I will be discussing that is an Arabic to English translation is B as in Beirut by Iman Humaydan Younes. This was translated by Max Weiss, and it was published by Interlink World Fiction, which is a publishing house. I think it's like an Arab American publishing house in Northampton, Massachusetts. So this takes place during the Lebanese Civil War. Iman Humaydan Younes is a Lebanese author, and it follows 4 different women's lives, and they all live in this apartment building in Beirut during the war, and their lives are kind of connected in various ways beyond being neighbors. I did review this book. I think it was like the first book I finished reading this year. But I think it's a pretty good exploration of what it means to live under war and how living under war becomes almost normalized and like part of your routine as you just sort of struggle to go about the day to day. And also, if you don't know like too much about the Lebanese Civil War that went on for 15 years, it is kind of an interesting place to start because it's not, reading this book isn't like super confusing. So yes, I would recommend picking this up. The next book I will be discussing is a book I read a couple years ago, and it is The Woman Destroyed by Simone de Beauvoir. This was translated, obviously, from French. So Simone de Beauvoir was a well-known second-wave feminist author. She wrote The Second Sex, I think, in like the late 40s. And she also published fiction. She was, I think, more of an existentialist type of writer. This has 3 different stories within it. The back says that Simone de Beauvoir draws us into the lives of 3 women, all past their first youth, all facing unexpected crises. So I remember the title story the best because it is about a woman whose husband ends up having this affair that's very out in the open with a young woman, and he ends up gaslighting her about it, essentially. And you can see the woman, the main character's like mental state slowly deteriorate over time. I feel like Simone de Beauvoir did not have the most highly esteemed view of marriage for women, if you could say that, which makes sense, particularly for her, the time period in which she was writing. But, yeah, I would recommend picking this up if you like more like existential, feminist themed, slanted works. And then my next French book is a book I also talked about in my March wrap-up, and I read it this year, and it is called Separate and Dominate, Feminism and Racism After the War on Terror. Incidentally enough, Simone de Beauvoir has a blurb quote. When did she die? She died in the 1960s. So I think Christine Delphy is quite, is also kind of old, up there in age. So this was published in 2008, and the translation came out in 2015. It was translated by David Broder. The French version was called Classe dominée, qui sont les autres? Who are the others? So this is about the current state of French feminism, and it's a pretty good exploration, I think, of how, one, feminism, particularly sort of bourgeois, middle-class, white feminism, can only sometimes become so myopic that it only is interested in uplifting a certain kind of woman that does not challenge the system. And 2, how certain kinds of feminism can be used as an excuse to justify racist measures. That there's a lot of like racism and xenophobia that is present in France's hijab ban laws that are, though, sold under this guise of feminism and this very patronizing white Western savior ideology. And France has never really, I think she argues in this book, reconciled with not only its colonial past, but its present as well, particularly in these countries in what is called the Middle East, as well as Africa. And she gets into, too, like, the war on terror and all of, like, the insane racist depictions of Arab and Muslims that ensued, as well as she talks about the Afghanistan war and how, like, the Afghanistan war was sold as a way to, like, liberate women, liberate them from the Taliban, when that wasn't really the goal at all. The goal was always about, like, stealing Afghanistan's resources and, like, you know, having this sort of, like, geopolitical base within the region. And so I think it was a pretty well done book. I think it was pretty intersectional, and this was published by Verso Books. So if you're interested in sort of like feminist theory, intersectionality, particularly the politics of France, I would highly recommend it. The next book I will be discussing is, we're moving on to Mexico, so we'll get into Spanish translations. And I just talked about this book, Faces in the Crowd by Valeria Luiselli. This was published in Mexico, and it is a novella. It was translated by Christina McSweeney. Okay, so finally a woman translator. I got into here. So this is about a young mother in contemporary Mexico City recalls her days as a translator, relevant, in New York, while in a recent past, a young translator wanders Harlem seeking out traces of the poet Gilberto Owen. And in 1950s Philadelphia, Owen dreams of New York and the young woman in a red coat he sees in the windows of passing trains. So the voices of these narrators end up overlapping and merging, and the woman translator, I believe, is her husband. She suspects her husband is having an affair with his business trips that he goes to in Philadelphia, and there is almost this, I believe there was almost sort of like a time traveling element, you could say, to this book. I read this quite a long time ago, but I think it's pretty unique, and I haven't really encountered anything like this. And I also don't often find that within fiction, when discussing America, like New York City and Los Angeles tend to like always be looked at, right? But it's interesting that Philadelphia as a city, which is not that far from New York City, actually gets some of the spotlight. So pretty solid, what I can remember. And then the next Mexican book, I don't own this. I got this from the library, and I read it recently, and it was called Trash by Sylvia Aguilar Zeleny. I think the person who translated it was named J.D. Pluecker. This is a novel about three women whose lives intersect with this trash dump in Juarez, Mexico. One woman is a scientist. She lives, I think, in Texas, so like on the borderlands, and she's studying the trash dump and its relation to the people that live in the dump, the homeless, and like the people who live around the dump. And then you also have a homeless girl, a teenage runaway, who left her home life because her stepfather was abusive and she is living at the dump. And then the third woman is the voice of a transgender sex worker who is sort of like the mother hen of these trans sex workers. She takes them in, she sort of provides for them, shows them the ropes. And these three women, their lives all intersect in ways beyond just the trash dump in Juarez. I thought it was pretty compelling, and I had never quite read anything like it. And unfortunately, though, it is the only English translated piece that this author has put out. But I really hope that someone else picks up and translates her other stuff into English. So moving on to Brazil is the very well-known author, and that is Clarice Lispector, The Besieged City. I picked this up a couple years ago in a little lending library. It's an ARC. Now, this was translated from Portuguese by Johnny Lorenz, and I think this was sort of like a posthumous release. I think this was like the first time it was released. And, you know, a lot of people love her, but I feel like I have to read her other stuff because this sort of like went like not in one ear, because I didn't read it. I didn't listen to it on audiobook. I read it. It like kind of went through my brain like water. And I think that she writes in a way that is very abstract, and I honestly don't even know what this was about. It is about a woman who marries a rich man. There's not a lot of dialogue, and it says, the plot is unlike any other Lispector narrative. A small-town gal marries rich, sees the world, and lives happily ever after. That said, there are miraculous horses, linguistic ecstasies, catty remarks, minor characters' visions, and music from unknown sources. So I guess there is sort of like this philosophical, navel-gazing kind of debate. I wanted to include her because she is so well known and so well respected, but Yeah, let me know in the comments below if you have read any Clarice Lispector and what your thoughts are, because I have heard that she is not always the most accessible in the way she writes, and I kind of want to get into her, but, you know, shout out to this book. I might have to reread it, but to be honest, it didn't really stick in my head. Now moving on to Italy with Italian translations, I have one, and that is Family Lexicon by Natalia Ginzburg. This was translated also by a woman, by Jenny McPhee. So I also had not heard of Natalia Ginzburg. I also got this in a little lending library a couple years ago, and it follows this Italian family. I think this is somewhat autobiographical, because if you look up Natalia Ginzburg's life, it sounds very similar. Her dad was a scientist and a professor. He was Jewish, and her mother was Catholic. And we sort of like, it takes place in Turin, Italy, and we follow the children of the family and their careers and marriages and all of that. But in the backdrop, it takes place, I think, in the 1930s. You know, Mussolini is rising to power, and the family are, of course, they're all very political. They're very fascist. The father and the children are half Jewish, so there's a lot going on in here. But I think that I do remember finding this quite interesting, and I think it is, you know, fascism is all everywhere now, so I think it is more relevant than ever, and I actually would like to check out more of this author's work at some point. And now, the last book I will be discussing, going to Japan, is Scattered All Over the Earth by Yoko Tawada. I reviewed this in one of my May wrap-ups. This was translated from Japanese by Margaret Mitsutani. And it is somewhat of a dystopian novel that deals with climate change and language and identity and communication and the erasure of a people via climate change, as well as how important language is to one's cultural identity. In this book, in the near distant future, Japan has completely disappeared. It has sunk into the ocean, and so the main character, Hiroko, she is on the hunt to find another person, another Japanese person that she can speak the language with and share her own cultural memories. And so it becomes this sort of rather absurd traveling story. It takes place, I think, like, starts in the Netherlands. They're on the hunt for, like, this sushi chef, and there's, like, a whole cast of characters. I did talk about, though, the one weird thing with this book was that the treatment of, like, the trans character was a little bit odd and questionable. But I do think, like, the themes that are discussed in this book are, again, more relevant than ever. So, yeah, those are all, I think, 10 books I discussed that I think you should pick up for Women in Translation Month, which is in August. And yeah, if you have any suggestions of translated works by women, please let me know in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.